The political hero of the Home Secretary is Margaret Thatcher. That's a Labour Home Secretary. We're hearing about plans to dub the boats crossing with migrants Farage boats because they have increased in number since Brexit stopped some of the other routes for people to come legally to the UK. We have ID cards that are going to be brought in. Let's not uncharitably call them Brit cards, but there they are, which are only being brought in, it would seem, to define who is eligible for work and try to weed out migrants. Is this the country you thought you lived in? It's certainly a stunning shock to the senses with every single passing day, particularly with the Labour conference. So we dissect that and look at the migration proposals from Labour and Reform and ponder some interesting history that saw the archives of Scotland sink in a boat in the 17th century off the Northumbrian coast with no report available really for the Scottish public. So that's the headlines. Here's the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's slightly delayed, so that we could listen to Kier Starmer's speech, Leslie Riddick podcast. Leslie, do you have your phone there with you?
I do, because...
Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, well, I was just wondering if you could show me the QR code for your Brit Card so that I can verify your identity before we begin here.
You wag. I know, it's just, I mean, I just don't know what's going on anymore, really. And I see people expressing this in all sorts of different ways. Just general shock at the kind of endless string of right-wing kind of authoritarian moves being put up by Labour. I was half listening and half watching to Starmer's speech yesterday. My stepdaughter's going back to the Far East and she suddenly, wanted to have lunch. And I thought, it's the last time I'll see her for 6 months. So I just dropped everything and went to see her. So I was kind of listening to it and thinking, the beginning of it was just, God, it was so cringe-making. It's something about the earnestness of the way he speaks when he was talking about the Hillsborough law that he'd passed and the bravery of the people who'd kept campaigning till they got the thing over the line. And that's absolutely true. But there's something completely nauseating about the way he speaks about it, to me anyway. And it's slightly because do you know what it reminds me of? People used to say this about Thought for the Day, that, somebody would come on and they would sort of, in a sense, be trying not to sound too religious until there was a certain point where they'd say, and and then suddenly
and that
you'd
very much reminds me of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because
exactly. And apologies to all of a Christian, persuasion, yeah. But it was just it was the sort of like, we're really not stupid. And the narrative kind of coming up to, making a religious point was so obviously signposted always by that wee phrase. And his thing was just, I do not claim these people, please. If you're going to give people any dignity, don't wind them into your narrative. Don't make them have to introduce you. Don't use their Christian names of their, dead relatives, which to the rest of us, we won't know, making you sound like you're part of the family. You're not, right? So, I have to say, my brain lifted from the start listening to this awful kind of cringe-making stuff. And of course, as you were noting in our wee text to one another, he sort of bravely went back into his tool making dad. You that bit shocked, well, not shocked you, repelled you, I think.
I think the first thing to say though is that Margaret Aspinall, who was the Hillsborough campaigner whose son James had lost his life at 18, she was fantastic. She started off by saying, I don't normally speak from notes. I have to speak from the heart and sort of convey, the truth as I see it. And I was immediately reflecting when she was leaving the stage, you've now had speaking from the heart and we've now wound up the Tin Man and pushed him onto the stage, ready to follow that. Thanks very much, Margaret. Fully fledged 3D human being that you are, making me look even worse. The toolmaker, raised its head again as a joke.
Yeah, exactly.
But then as a serious bit. But nobody realised he was sliding into serious bit, so they still thought he was joking. So they're still laughing. Go, but do you realise how the dignity there is in working with your hands, and do you know how skilled it is? But nobody had kind of caught up with the fact that we'd gone for a kind of gear shift at that point.
Because that took us into, I mean, this was, if you could just sometimes just kind of just give us your policy thing. So he's undoing Blair's thing of, 50% of people should be university educated to, I think, 2/3 should be university and apprenticeship educated.
Gold-plated
of course, I'm sorry.
None of your bog standard apprenticeships here.
And give it a week and it'll have a wee Union Jack on it as well. Kind of, oh God. Anyway, so people seemed happy enough with that. But this is like the boiled frogs. If you're in that party and in that room, you just need to, well, first of all, I was reading very amusing accounts of it from, those who were of different persuasions, the National Reporter and so on, who amazingly got in. To just be surrounded by waving flags. I mean, maybe it's my experience in Northern Ireland, because the days that you are surrounded by people, waving Union Jacks with pavements painted red, white and blue, with every shop window, asserting all of that, is a day to not be in Northern Ireland, really. So it actually brings a fear response out in me, because that has been, my experience of the collection of Union Jacks. But this is, again, coming back, sorry, long ramble, back to your ID card idea. I mean, this is, when I heard that, I just thought, right, I mean, unbroadcastable, leavable, because, they were quoting Estonia and Denmark. And I was having used ID cards. And funnily enough, having done 2 films about them, and particularly Estonia, there's 2 points to make about that, which is, first of all, those 2 countries have got the highest levels of trust between citizens and the government in the world, along with the other Nordics. And they're light years ahead of us. And you need that, because you are essentially giving the state access to pretty much everything about you, and you're casting aside all other sorts of duplications, checks, other systems. You're letting the state just have one system to run everything. And of course, if you can trust that state, it is going to streamline stuff. I do remember the last at Estonia talking about just not having to sign documents, because they can all be electronically signed, saving something unbelievable like 2% of GDP. So, there's no question that moving towards digital stuff works, but it's got to be so transparent. The governments have got to work at it. Estonia built its entire economy on a digital revolution that include, the first thing they did when they got money in 1991, when they had nothing and became independent, the wee bit of money they got was spent buying laptops for children, not for executives sitting in, posh offices, and definitely not to try and weed out migrants in their midst. So they have maybe still about 20% of people with Russian origin. That's a livener at a time like this, but that's something they have had to work with. So here's the differences. Not only do we not have those levels of trust to swing in on ID cards, hence the petition. I don't know where it's at the moment. The last time I looked at it, it was something like 2.25 million or something who are opposed to it. But it's also to bring it in and explicitly couch it as you want to use this to try and catch migrants who are here. You can't have to show this to be able to work legally. Really? Because both Estonia and Denmark use that card. I mean, that's way down the food chain of reasons you would have the card. It is to make the public services that are infinitely more powerful, generous, life-supporting, to make them easily accessible.
I mean, I didn't really understand this in a whole load of different levels. So if you're here and you're not a British citizen and you have a reason to be here, so you're here studying or you're here on a work visa, you already have a biometric residence permit or biometric residence card, which was a physical card that said you had no recourse to public funds, and this was the reason for your visa, and it confirmed your right to work. And then there's an employer's checking service where you can put these details in and it comes up and says, yes, you can employ this person, or no, you can't employ this person. And that was being phased out anyway, and was already being mostly phased out to an e-visa, which again was a thing on the Gov UK app. But we've kind of gone over this hurdle now, thanks to Labour Together, with its Brit Card paper, policy paper. I mean, do none of these people actually do politics? You know, we don't live in a vacuum. Hang on. Wasn't this one of the things that was a real undoing of the Tony Blair government? What happened to all the massive opposition to that? There were various Yes Minister clips circulating, you know, from the 70s of threats to bring in an EU identity card, and how, you know, this was going to have Brits up in arms. And having never been conquered, we certainly won't be showing our papers to any EU technocrat. This is a highly, highly contentious thing to do. And then you try and, even although it's not the main government, it was a kind of offshoot of the Labour Party, a Labour Party think tank that called it a Brit Card to begin with. But it gives you a very ready handhold for your opposition if you're in any other part of the UK. Just beggars belief.
And actually, now that you've made me think about it, you know, were Labour not up in arms when the Tories brought in compulsory ID for voting?
Yes, of course.
So it's kind of like, it's as if, and this is the thing that I found in the end. So I only caught one part of the speech where he was basically going right over the top. And just, you know, all his stuff about the fork and the ways, and this is, you know, we can lead to a happy valley, and, you know, Nigel Farage is leading to despair.
Dignity or division.
That one, sorry, yes.
Or decency, rather. Decency.
Well, it could have been dignity, yeah. You know, but whatever. And you know, the kind of idea that you're going to end up with voters who now have just got to a sort of just cheesed off thing. They're looking now to say, on the whole, where are you coming from? And it looks to me now, just listening to all of it, that all of these new kind of initiatives they're coming out with, almost by the second, are forced. Because if they had been, you know, something that was important to the party, it would have been rolled out when they were taking winter fuel allowances away from pensioners. And now that may be unfair, you know, because, hey, what have we got? The second wave, or what's it called at the moment? The second something of the party. But, you know, maybe they can say they were always planning this sort of line. But when it doesn't sound like, it sounds like all of it has been dreamt up just in response to Reform's lead. And so you look at this, and it's not cutting muster. You know, it's not making, I would imagine, anybody who's beginning to think the game's a bogey, it's not going to make a difference. And actually, there was one tremendous interview, I think it was on the weekend, Good Morning Scotland, and it was about then Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary's announcements about indefinite leave to remain changing. This is the one where it's going to be cut from 10 to 5 years. Migrants need to have a good grasp of English, clean criminal record, work in the community, don't claim benefits. There's a great guy
Doubles rather than cut.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, that's right.
Which is important.
Steve Smith is a guy from Care for Calais, which is a charity that works in France. He's actually, funnily enough, he's a former British Army colonel, which you sort of wouldn't guess from, you know, the sort of tilt of his contributions. But he did make a tremendous kind of set of observations about where we are now, calling everything Labour's coming up with right now utterly performative. And he went through all the different initiatives we'd had. And I don't know about other people's brains, but I just can't carry this amount of endless change. So you begin to forget. And then perhaps you either decide the game's a total bogey and these guys are useless, or you just get blurred out and probably just start watching Netflix a lot. But he pointed out, we've had Smash the Gangs. Nobody's really talking about that anymore. We've had one in, one out, which just resulted in a dribble of people coming in and out. But his important point is, we've had the end of safe routes for people fleeing Afghanistan. And restrictions on family reunification. Now, those sound like dry, you know, whatever. But here he's making the point that what's going to happen if you kind of move ahead with all of this, particularly with cutting those safe routes for people fleeing the Taliban. What is the obvious outcome? He says it's going to be that more people come through the dangerous journey across to Calais and then across to the Channel because that safe route's being closed down. And the other one, restrictions on family reunification. I'm sure people think, well, what? Yeah, that's fine. But he's saying what that means is if a guy is traveling in advance from a bad situation, gets here, looks to bring vulnerable members of his family, like wives and children, into the country, now they can't do that because of restrictions on family reunification. How are they going to do it? And he says, again, you'll see more vulnerable, more women and children trying to cross the Channel. So when you get people who are kind of at the sharp end of all of this, looking at what's being proposed, and actually a brave move on his part as well, which I completely agree with, where he's saying, here we are utterly preoccupied now. And even the opinion polls in Scotland are suggesting that migration is now way up the things that people worry about, because we're not having any big vision about shifting a completely broken state that has never functioned, actually since before Thatcher, but totally not functioning since then, where, the price of electricity is going up today. Sorry to keep going on about it, folks, but came back from Finland. Their district heating is basically part of the municipal tax they pay because it's supplied by their council, like every big city in the Scandies and probably across Europe. And no one I found could actually weasel out which bit of that was heating because it was really quite low. And I'm sitting with a scarf on and a bonnet practically, who's trying to solve this properly? Things not working, small things about the NHS in England. They have to keep their digital, however sort of online platforms open to our people who basically can't get appointments. It's the same as Scotland. This country is just stumbling around on rock bottom. And what if you're not going to acknowledge that and start saying, this is how big a transformation we'd need completely to have a country worth living in. And that would mean, absolutely, it would mean wealth taxes. It would mean a whole load of things to equalise society. If you're not going to do that, then you leave scunnered people thinking it's the migrants' faults. And I had a conversation with a woman at a really bad moment. It was a funeral I went to recently, but these are the conversations you get into, who'd come up from England and was asking me what I thought about the migration crisis. And I thought, oh dear, here we go. And she was saying, well, I'm a receptionist at a doctor's and I know most of the people signing on at the moment are migrants. And she talked about going to A&E. And I said, just as a matter of interest, when you were in A&E, was it full of migrants, the patients? And she said, well, actually, to be honest, it wasn't. And I said, well, if there's problems with A&E, then is that really a migrant problem, or is that a complete underfunding problem and a problem of the NHS south of the border still being in private trusts? And then the conversation just stopped because nobody's getting to anything like this level of critique for what's going on. Rant over.
I mean, plus we're getting this total mixing up of legal and illegal migration. And I think a lot of the things about the speech and the as you say, the kind of performative actions that are being taken, I always, when I'm looking at these things, have a phrase, does it benefit from being true? And several points of that speech, particularly suggesting that, Nigel Farage doesn't care about Britain, which you can see what he's trying to do there, kind of offset their, decent, fair play, cricketing, nice Labour Party under Sir Kier Starmer versus this sort of grubby little oik in Farage. But it did sound very hollow. It's the same as we were talking about the other week with their, I've got St. George's flag, up in the bathroom type rubbish. It's all very performative. It's a bit fluffy and forced and doesn't really have any sort of genuine feel about it. In as same as much as is kind of, people who have concerns are not racist. and retelling the story of having visited this lady at a by-election shortly after he'd been elected, and how she showed him all the photographs of her at her neighbour's wedding and how proud she'd been to be at this friend's wedding and how good friends she was with this Asian lady next door, but that she had other concerns around immigration. But you could kind of see in his eyes, very similar to the Mrs. Duffy and just a very bigoted woman under Brown. But I mean, he took a swipe at Brown in that, and a swipe at Brown in the post-financial crash, and a swipe at Blair. It was a kind of ditching of all kind of recent Labour history and what I suppose other people might see as Labour successes. And I think Gordon Brown would certainly be pretty miffed at his much vaunted by himself legacy of being the person who saved the world from a banking crisis, as far as he's concerned. Quite unusual, I thought, in the ditching of other kind of Labour totems, and this constant rephrase, and that's why we changed the party. Because that's why we made it less Labour-like, so that we could get elected and cozy up to the Farageist voters. But they're under real problems. Their vote is hemorrhaging all over the place. There's small amounts of it going to Reform, loads of another sort of 10% going to the Greens, another 10% going to the Liberal Democrats, and a chunk to come to go to your party once it gets up and running as a kind of electoral force. And the polling pre-conference showing that Starmer, I think, is the most unpopular Prime Minister ever, 79% unsatisfaction rating, with no real plan. And there, a lot of the commentary around the Labour Party conference seemed to be that the party itself was admitting that they were slightly bounced when they came into government, and an unexpected level of landslide, and they weren't really prepared, and they had the usual difficulties of trying to change the civil service machine and get it to do what they wanted, which again rang very hollow. I mean, the whole 2 years leading up to the end of the Sunak government was about the fact that we were going to be having a change of government, and it was inevitable. And even the sort of BBC basically championing a change of government and all these kind of stories, and they're off learning how to be cabinet ministers, blah, blah, blah. So a bit bizarre in that regards. Bridget Phillipson got a good couple of mentions, just so, wink, wink, by the way. This is the candidate to vote for deputy leader, a bit of party management there. And I think 3 mentions of Anas Sawar. They're kind of pinning their hopes into the 2026 elections, which look like a very forlorn hope, and could be the moment where Starmer's prime ministership is at its weakest.
Well, indeed. I mean, there was a fascinating exchange. In fact, I think again it might have been on Radio Scotland actually, where there was a guy, Matthew Torbett. Now that name's in the news today. He was a former advisor to Labour, and his pass was revoked at Liverpool. He was there, and if you look on his Twitter feed, I was looking at it just to find out who he was, because an excellent interview, actually, where he was predicting a Joe Biden moment coming in May, which is, basically everybody shuffles up to him and says, Joe, you're just too old for the job, mate, to Kier Starmer. Now, that was because, not just because, Scotland looks likely to return an independence majority again, but actually Wales is the one that could be really moving differently. It looks as if at the moment, Plaid's going to be the largest party, and Labour could actually come third, which is, completely mind-blowing, because I think it's true that you need to be more than 100 years old to remember Labour not winning a general election in Wales. That's how long that's been. So what you get in that situation is, the First Minister of Wales potentially being a Plaid person and being a nationalist, the Northern Ireland Assembly being led by Sinn Féin First Minister, nationalist, and a nationalist in the shape of John Swinney leading the Scottish Parliament. And that's even before you factor in, which will obviously worry them more, which is the English local elections, where they're going to get thumped by reform. But if that kind of comes to pass, not only is that just losing every which way, but it's telling a story which is, to my mind, like a replication of the Brexit story, where there is sort of a uniform outlook as to what is wrong or what should be done in this country within Scotland, right down to the last wards at the border remain, and utterly different on the other side of the border. It accentuates completely how much Scotland and England are different countries. We get another way of presenting a totally different set of political outlooks. Never mind that we've now then got all the Celtic nations deciding that the way they want to go is to have independence, or at least in the case of Wales, probably more autonomy from an England that is just now completely toxic. So anyway, that he was on writing about this, Matthew Torbett, and also, on interviews. And then lo and behold, he discovered when he went out from the Liverpool conference and tried to get back in again, his pass had been revoked. So it's kind of, this is really hopeless. It sounds just so chaotic. And I mean, when we're back to, before we leave this, God knows we need to leave this, there was an interview where, in the same way as Starmer had thrown in the racist line and then sort of didn't really want to repeat it because he got pelters, he threw in a line that the boats coming across the channel should be now called Farage boats, because the increase in them coming dates from Brexit, because the Dublin Agreement, which allowed some folk to be put back without an argument, that got lost. And it's true that the big increase in people coming across happened after Brexit. That happened in one interview. And again, that completely riled Nigel Farage, who's writing in the Daily Mail and anything else he can get his hands on. But I mean, that's the level we're down to in politics now. This is pathetic.
Hello?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, you went pathetic, and then we'll cut that back.
No, it is just pathetic.
It's just totally pathetic. I thought Farage, bizarrely, was quite slick in his counterfire. So he was set up at a podium ready to go and fired back. I mean, I can't remember anything that he said other than sort of his usual boo-ha-ha stuff, although he did invoke the Charlie Kirk assassination, which I really, is horrid and as a dreadful attack on free speech, but I don't think had a huge amount of cross pollination in the way that some of the more right-wing people in the UK keep advocating for it, almost in the way that they're utilising. How dare Starmer say this, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination? But they were kind of very quick off the mark, ready and waiting, not with a statement, but with an actual proper going live on social media and having that picked up by various news outlets, countering some of the stuff that Starmer had put forward. And that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like, did it have the benefit of being true, or did it have the benefit that anybody would actually think that it's a credible narrative to run? I think there were far stronger lines that he could have used against Farage, rather than saying that, like John Swinney, Farage wants Britain to fail. It's like
yes,
a weird way of shoehorning that rhetoric in.
But yeah, the other thing that's happened this morning then is David Lammy, again in some interview, has described Farage as being a supporter of Hitler Youth in his own early, in his own early days, which has now sparked, complete furore. If you look at it, it seems that Farage's own teachers came out in 2013 and actually gave accounts of the sort of way he used to persecute some students, and that there was late night carousing parties and whatever, with them marching around late at night, singing Hitler Youth songs and salutes and so on. So, I mean, this is true, but where are we going with this? It's just to keep applying labels. You need to have a different outlook as to where you're going with all the stuff. You've either got to try to say, in proportion to every other country that's taking in migrants, we're the same or less. You've got to say that we actually have been starved of migration and we rely on it. And actually, a lot of people coming in are pretty talented and they work, which is, I mean, you've seen them try this and it just withers in the face of Farage's attacks. But that's also because beneath it, there is a state that doesn't work. And as long as that's happening, people will just essentially say, talk to the hand. In addition to which, you mentioned this last week, the Boris wave of migrants that are due to come in January 2026. These are the folk that have been here since they were able to come just in the post-Brexit period, as everything was kind of levelling out, and they're reaching their 5 years. So there's a fear that there's going to be in the new year, just when you don't want it, ahead of all these as they'll call it, local elections, but national elections and the English locals. They're going to end up with quite a substantial number of people claiming indefinite leave to remain. And now they're guddling around because they're trying to see if can they apply this retrospectively, because these people have already been here for 5 years. Can they apply retrospectively that you can't automatically make that application after 5 years residency when you've already been here? And if you're doing that, wow, you're going to end up with kind of legal challenges, pelters from all directions. I mean, in many ways, I would not want to wake up being Kier Starmer of a morning, or any of them, especially not Shabana Mahmood, who told another, outlet that her political heroes were Benazir Bhutto and Margaret freaking Thatcher.
Yes, I mean, that it reminded me of Gordon Brown having Margaret Thatcher over to tea just to remind everybody that he wasn't that socialist, which, Brown is far, far, far to the left of Starmer. Indefinite leave to remain is not a cheap thing to do. I think it's about $3,000. The Labour Party proposal, I think, they're saying is not going to be retrospective, so it's not going to apply to people who are already in the UK. But 10 years is a heck of a long time. If you moved to Australia or something, or you moved to the UK because you've got a job here, an academic, or you're a doctor or a nurse, or you've come on some other skilled route, your whole life can pretty much be set in 10 years. I've just had my 10-year wedding anniversary, so it's very much kind of at the forefront of my mind. So most of these, if you come lawfully, your normal right to apply for indefinite leave to remain, which if you have to remember is so that you're not continually having to apply for visas, and that's what Farage is suggesting, that you will just keep applying for 5-year visas and be kind of unstable for the rest of your life and at the will of changing policies and changing demands. So that, after 3 shots of that, we could maybe decide actually we don't need this type of skill any longer. So could you just pack up and go to your country of origin, please? But, after 10 years, I think we've moved 3 times with 2 children. You're pretty stable and set within your community. And this is, of course, only applying to people who are here lawfully. Mm-hmm. And it's not citizenship. Once you have indefinite leave to remain, you could then make further applications to gain citizenship and the right to vote. So,
but it does give you the right to claim benefits and have an education and
yep.
whatever else.
And then the Labour Party proposal is that at the time, certainly that you're applying, they're going to change the rules so that you can't do it if you're on benefits. And you have to be completely squeaky clean in terms of any criminal activities. So even the kind of low level, things that you might accidentally get up to, or, fisticuffs
speeding
after a
tickets.
night up or things like that. Speeding possibly not as much because that's not a criminal conviction, but, you're talking, or you can be meaning very low level things or things that don't actually proceed. So, I've certainly seen cases, for example, where somebody was attacked and then there had to be an investigation as to kind of what actually went down. The police are still sitting on it and you're waiting to renew your visa, for example, as a chef. And until the process has been completed, you can't work, you can't claim any kind of benefit, and you can't have your application go forward. So I've seen people who have had job offers who were attacked, you know, outside a pub or something, and there was still a debate as to, you know, who was in the wrong. And because this police investigation was ongoing, you can't proceed. So, you know, these things have a really significant impact on people's lives. And as I was saying last week, I think that's where Faragism starts to come unstuck. You know, your kind of background hum of racism has a wider appeal, sadly, to more people than when you get into the specifics. Actually, it's Mrs. Coley in the health centre that does your blood test that's actually going to be removed. It's your mum's care home. It's individuals that you live and work alongside. Not just a kind of amorphous blob of people that are elsewhere and more built up environments or, you know, kind of in your mind as a problem. And I do think hopefully Farage will come a bit unstuck there. Although I was wandering around in Edinburgh yesterday or the day before, and I went past Dummy Dykes and I thought, oh, look, there's a saltire, that's quite jolly. Oh, there's another saltire, that there must be two lots of independent supporters, happy days. Oh, look, no, there's a third one and a Union flag and saltire bunting across the lampposts. Maybe these are not jolly saltires, maybe these are unhappy saltires, and it's a real kind of sucker punch to see, you know, our flags being misused like that. And very weird to see all these Labour MPs and conference with their enforced flag waving yesterday at the speech.
Aye. And the other thing that I heard, but this depends on the media keeping on the case with this, what you were describing earlier about Mrs. Coley potentially being deported, or, you know, when it becomes a tangible story, when there are narratives behind it and you realize how long people are staying here. I mean, one of the things I noticed was that, you know, there would be, in I think even Farage's proposals, there would be, I think EU citizens would be immune. I can't remember, there was some other group. But I'm thinking about my pal who's from Iceland, who's the consul here from Iceland, who's lived here for, is it 47 years now? You know, they're not in the EU.
Yep.
So, you know, it's
Yeah.
this,
So, you know,
you
first they
suddenly
came for
start.
the architects.
So you sort of begin to, you know, as your mind begins to go through it, you begin to realize one case that you know well will absolutely catalyze everything that's, you know, unfair about this and just not your idea of how society works, if the media keep highlighting it. And that's the if, because at the rate of knots we're going through things, you know, and the right-wing control of a lot of the media and the sort of pusillanimousness of much of it in the beeb sometimes, you know, we're really going to be struggling for that. I mean, there was one good case of a person that was on talking about this, giving back to the community through volunteering. And it was a woman who said she's already working 70 hours a week as a care worker. Not quite sure where she came from, but she's, you know, she's in that position that she is applying or has got indefinite leave to remain. And she's basically saying, there's no way I've got time to do any community work. And actually, the interviewer, who was a Five Live guy, just kept banging away at her case over and over and over again. I mean, there's a limit to how often you can do that when you get bullshit back from, you know, whatever Labour grandee is in position. But interviewers can choose to highlight some of the ludicrous aspects of what's before us instead of just running into a bun fight as to kind of, you know, it's like a ping pong match. You know, Starmer says something, then Farage says something, then Starmer reacts, then somebody else reacts. And God, it's just utterly depressing.
It is. And, you know, it takes it beyond the realms of just being an ordinary citizen. You have to be an extraordinary citizen. You know, there's only so many five-a-side football teams that one country can support.
Yeah.
And, you know, no. Well, I've got to get my volunteering numbers up so I can get a number of hours in order to apply for indefinite leave to remain at $3.5 grand. Yeah, it's a sehr fecht, and I still think a lot of it is performative. The actual issues that people have are irregular migration, people working in the UK unlawfully, and employers exploiting workers who are in that circumstance. And as you say, not providing safe routes for people to flee from war-torn situations or other problems and persecution around the world in a way that would meet our obligations to refugee and asylum seekers.
Right, that's enough of them, isn't it? Yeah, so
So, yes.
move on to the cheery subject of Israel. And
Yes, and I was going to try to think of a suitable title for ex Supremo Blair, new head of the Board of Peace for the Confederation of the West Bank and Gaza.
it's quite a one, isn't it? Because I mean, and it just shows you how many different audiences the world is divided into. Because obviously, for all the kind of great and the good, Tony Blair's inclusion, he was the quartet envoy on the Middle East for sort of many years. He also pushed through the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which you could say ended the Troubles. But Iraq, a total disaster. And actually, an interesting piece in The Guardian that says that more than that, when he was this quartet envoy, and people hoped in Palestine that he would champion their case for having a Palestinian state, he was much more about trying to create business opportunities. I mean, honestly, it's like blooming Trump light in the area. And at one key point, when Hamas won a vote in 2006, and it looked like at that point the group was open to political engagement, Blair sided with Bush and Israel in rejecting the results, supported a boycott of Hamas, and although he did later meet some of the leaders, but the boycott contributed to Hamas moving towards what was eventually a violent takeover of Gaza in 2008. And belatedly, Blair conceded not that long ago that the international community should have tried to pull Hamas into dialogue far earlier. But, the guys quoted here, the Palestinian experts, are saying he was one of the main obstacles to that, and still probably has that outlook that he prioritizes economic development over political progress and self-determination of the Palestinian people. And there's been multiple failed efforts of that in the West Bank. And actually, I don't know if people are watching Channel 4 News, there was a completely gobsmacking report by Porrick O'Brien on the life being led by people in the West Bank, watching the gathering lights of settlers' vans high up on the hills above their villages, which they're just, experiencing raids, pot shots. One family that he interviewed, every single one of them, children, the mother, the lot of them, were sitting all bandaged up because they were just completely beaten up by settlers who then withdrew, all encouraged by the Israeli government, who are, while everybody's kind of got their eyes on Gaza, there's going to be no land left to have a Palestinian state on. And that's what people are focusing on here, because all of this in the West Bank suggests that you've got to get Palestinian self-rule and basic freedom of movement organised to be able to have any enterprise, not the other way around. That's never going to be the way Tony Blair looks at it, or any of them.
Indeed. And, it's like they've kind of gone around the world thinking, who could we get that they really dislike? Hamas leadership is to be exiled, the group is to formally disband. But as I say, as you say, rather, at the same token, while we're still seeing Israeli settlers grubbing up people's fruit trees and olive trees and destroying livelihoods and businesses and pushing further and further into land. And whilst there's now a kind of what appears to be an overwhelming desire to recognize Palestine as a state, but without any real purpose or thrust behind that. And Netanyahu absolutely implacably opposed to that. it seems very difficult to see what the way forward is in this 20-point plan from Trump, which has been cocked up with Netanyahu. Seems very unlikely to be the route to success.
Yeah, there's been plenty of people on pointing out, that for Hamas taking out the objective, even at some distant point of a Palestinian state, makes it almost impossible for them to accept that because that's their raison d'etre. And actually other people reporting that there's been huge recruitment into Hamas, much as you might think it's impossible for that force to, still be the same as it was at the start of this war. Apparently there's been recruitment, as there has been in all these, the extreme Islamist groups, as a result of the wars that are going on around them. So there's still a lot of force in there. And other people I was listening to saying, again, you've got to remember that, and I don't know enough about this, but, they were saying Hamas is like Al-Qaeda, a death cult, so that these guys will die before they give up what they have struggled their lives to do. On the other hand, there's kind of a process going on, and the Hamas say they're consulting everybody within Gaza, which is difficult because their access is limited. But it's still, the predictions of failure are just so widespread. Even though it looks in the face of it like something should be doable here, there's no trust. There's no trust in the intermediaries. Netanyahu himself has got 2 members of his own cabinet threatening to leave, which would destabilize the whole thing. And it's unbelievable to think that you need Netanyahu in place to have any kind of stability to deliver something. But, there's a couple of other right-wingers saying they would join to create a sort of government of national unity to let him pass this stuff through, which again makes you think this is just a smokescreen for the whole business of taking over the whole Palestinian lands going on behind whatever different kind of excuses there are now for the end of the war, and actually all the while the extension of stuff into the West Bank continues apace.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a horrible, horrible situation. And, why would you give up on the idea of statehood at this stage when that's closer than at any other time, sadly, in history? It just doesn't have any real grounding and connection with what is going on and what the motivations and desires of the people who actually live there are. And ultimately that will be what it's deemed to failure. I just tried to pull up the actual White House press announcement and clicked on it. White House briefing room statements, blah, 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 President Trump's 20-point plan, and got a 404 page not found error. And I think that, sums it up, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, where else are we going? We should say, actually, this is maybe apropos of nothing, but just we're very conscious that there's been a push by Salvo to try and get Scotland recognised as a colony going on. I've been in touch with Sarah Salyers to try and get a special done on that. We've been waiting, in a sense, till there's a bit of a conclusion to see how well it's been going. I should say I met Douglas Chapman, the former SNP MP for Rosyth, coming back from something in Edinburgh, and he'd also been over in Europe at an EFTA conference where this is the alternative grouping to the EU, who were Norway and Iceland, all kind of keen for an independent Scotland to join their crew as opposed to the EU. So there's stuff going on behind the scenes, and we'll try to get in touch and bring that to you quite soon.
Yeah, and I think it's something that everybody should be open to, and it is a move that's going on. It's not obviously going to make Scotland independent, and I don't think Salvo now, although they perhaps have in the past, have advocated it as a kind of one-stop shop that Scotland is already independent and it just needs to be recognised. That is not what is really being put forward. It does seem to get some people's backs up because it talks about Scotland being a colony, although the actual the actual UN definition rather, is a non-self-governing territory, which I think is much closer to what we would see as a normal description of Scotland. It has to some degree, I think some of the less successful things that are happening internally in Scotland politically with it as a movement are what you might call the sort of the zeal of a convert. It's a bit like when people try to explain why veganism is much better for you than eating a dairy product. They do. So people who are the kind of first wave to have discovered this as a route are very, very, very keen on it, and are sort of perhaps a little bit too dismissive for people who are concerned or are unsure as to what the value of it might be. It is another prong, and for me, it's another opportunity, or one of the few opportunities that are currently being seized, to explain to people in important positions outside the UK why Scotland should wish to be a country. And after Brexit, there's a much more welcoming audience for people who are kind of go, right, I get it now. I thought you guys were in a kind of successful political union and there were some Bampot blood and soil nationalists over there, but no, you're the sensible multilateral guys who want to build bridges and build connections, and you're stuck to a country that's kind of lost the plot. So it is something that is an interesting development. It's certainly not something that I would want to decry. I have seen sort of Twitter statements and stuff like that recently by people who maybe take a more mainstream view, like Pete Wishart, suggesting that it's not a useful thing to do, and that we would be, sacrificing the veto of the rest of the UK for a veto of the UN Security Council. But again, doesn't have the benefit of being true, as I say. That's not what's being asked. There's a kind of subcommittee, and you only need a kind of simple majority, I think, of people at the UN to add us onto the list. It's not going to make Scotland independent. We will have to have a democratic process for that. And as we're seeing, as we talked about the problems that Starmer is having and the weakness that he will have post 2026, it does make 28-29 all the more relevant at a UK general election level if the 2026 Holyrood election doesn't become a kind of plebiscite or a democratic mandate for Scotland to be an independent country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well summarised. But actually, I was speaking to Douglas. He thought as well that actually he'd heard there was a BBC crew got sent out to cover what was happening with Salvo et al. And that was that's a rare enough moment. Don't know that we've seen any output out of it. But anyway, fact ends. The other thing on the kind of cultural appropriation front, ages ago, we did a wee special podcast about Scottish culture with Roger Emerson and Stuart McCarty, and people, really enjoyed that one. This is now, it was a wee while ago actually, so this is how long this has been waiting to be raised. Fraser Darling, who's a listener, got in touch about his dad Ken, who's 80. Hello Ken, hello Fraser. And he's basically writing about the day Scotland's history sank beneath the waves, as he's put it, because this is another bit of lost history, which his dad stumbled across by going on a tour of Stirling Castle and finding a treaty on display. And what it amounts to was, way back in the day, 1651, Oliver Cromwell's invasion of Scotland, England, with the English parliamentary forces. They seized control of Edinburgh Castle. Inside the walls, there was something more important than gold, the national records of Scotland. These included royal charters, parliamentary registers, legal documents, and original treaties of the Auld Alliance with France. So rather than leave these sort of, kind of potentially susceptible to Cromwell's invasion, apparently, according to Historic Environment Scotland, they were packed off to Stirling Castle for safekeeping. But the next year, Cromwell's commander, General Monk, arrived, laid siege, basically took the castle and took all that material down to London. It wasn't then until Charles II was crowned in 1660. So I'm trying to look at my maths there, how long that is. But, that's quite a while. When there was plans to bring all those records back to their rightful home in Edinburgh. And this is the point, they never made it. They were put onto a merchant vessel called the Elizabeth of Burnt Island. It sank in stormy weather in 1661 off the Northumbrian coast. Some people say it was not the most seaworthy of vessels.
One of these whoops-a-daisy moments. Gosh, how did that happen?
We're
always going for these times when we transport important Scottish records. Oh, well, not to worry.
Well, but, this is this Historic Environment Scotland's blog, which says that the captain of the Elizabeth was reluctant to take the precious cargo. There was, this is not something I can estimate easily, but 85 hogshead barrels of 2 tons of paper, amounting to half the records of Scotland, some dating as far back as the reign of Robert the Bruce. And they just went straight down. It's Fraser's asking, why was such, valuable, irreplaceable documents placed on a single vessel? Why was there no duplication? And obviously, it's a whoops-a-daisy, a deliberate act of imperial erasure. He's also gone into the history of it a bit and seen that some of the same thing happened in India, royal documents being seized and lost after the 1857 uprising in India. So it's kind of like there's previous on all of this. But his big thing that he wants to stress is that the scandal, he feels, is not just that the documents were lost, 300-400 years ago, but that the loss has been hidden from public consciousness. And actually, when I looked a bit further, I discovered that there's a composer, Neil Thomas Smith, who wrote a piece last year for the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, which was based on surviving tiny scraps of Renaissance music for Scotland. The problem being that most of the records and books that also contained Scotland's music were on the Elizabeth. And because all of that was sent to, watery oblivion, he's saying it led to the assumption that during lost centuries between 1200 and 1500, little music of sophistication was written or performed in Scotland. So he wrote a new piece to creatively debunk this assumption from the tiny fragments that are left. And all of this, you don't need to be one of us card-carrying, conspiracy-seeking whatevers, to look at this and just think that this is a massive chunk of our history that has been lost. And the story of its loss, a tiny footnote on one exhibit in Stirling Castle, which, one man was smart enough, Ken Darling was smart enough to ask about, and, we should know more. And I totally agree. And thanks for the email.
Fascinating. It is very apt that it should be at Stirling, which is one of, greatest Renaissance palaces that you can actually visit and understand the level of sophistication and decoration with the restoration of the Stirling heads. It makes me remember, what's that?
Fiona Bruce.
Fiona Bruce.
Your favourite broadcaster?
Yes, it was one of these, television presenters that pass themselves off as historians, even though they're absolutely not historians. She had a series at some point recently with the Queen's Palaces, but there was something before that, just a kind of general history of the UK type thing. And I remember her going to Fontainebleau and talking about how, overawed the young Mary Queen of Scots would have been, coming from the dismal, damp backwater of Scotland to the French court, and how shocking that would be. And then there was another bit later on when she was at the Palace of Holyrood House, kind of looking up at how plain the ceiling was and contrasting that obviously when the Dauphin of France died and Mary came back to Scotland, how drab and interesting it would have been at that point. But of course, her mother was Mary de Guise. Scotland was a as much part of the international Gothic and art movements as anywhere else. She grew up and was born in some fabulous Renaissance palaces at Falkland, Stirling, and looking at the ceiling of Holyrood as it stands does hardly tell you anything about what it was like when Mary Queen of Scots was there. But the kind of underlying message was, Scotland was crapper than France, and you didn't have anything of note or culture or refinement here. It was all kind of brutal and brutish, which were completely the opposite from the actual reality. And it just paints a totally false narrative about Scotland's culture and its history over the centuries.
Although, just swinging the other way a bit, I can't remember what I was watching. It was one of the programs that Paul Merton does, which is the Grand Tours. He's done Grand Tours of islands, lochs, and he's doing rivers in Scotland. I mean, they are fascinating programs. And this one was looking particularly at the Oikel, which is, so few people will even be able to place this on a map. But this is a long river that spans across kind of the northern part above the Great Glen Fault. And comes out of the Dornoch Firth. But the route of it takes you through areas that were just at the root of the clearances. And actually, he recalls in it the year of the big sheep, which I think, I'm trying to remember what that was now. I think it was the 1790s, when the sheep had been introduced. People will know this. Again, it's in the abstract, this, that people were basically turfed out to begin to, have sheep cover the entire pasture grazing. There was a big protest, actually, by local people one night when all the sheep were gathered up and taken up onto the highlands and just dumped there. Actually, everybody faded away back into the hills. So the next day when the troops turned up, there was nobody there, but the sheep were all in the wrong place, And that, in his narrative of the piece, was what essentially then triggered the complete clearance of that glen. And it was a busy enough glen to have had so many men they could have done, taken, I think that he quoted something like 20,000 sheep, moved that many. By 1841, it was empty. And it went on very close to it. People might have heard of the Church of Croic, which is up in that kind of neck of the woods, in the middle of the land, which is now an empty land. But this is the church where many people facing eviction essentially across the sea to Canada and America were waiting to be basically turfed out, having done nothing wrong, paid their rent, ticked all the boxes. But it was terrible weather even in May, and they gathered in the graveyard outside the church. There's dispute about this, but it appears the minister was quite welcome for them to come in. But they felt themselves the only explanation for what was happening to them, the end of their lives, really, as they'd known it for generations, was that they were the wicked generation. And on the glass of one of the window panes, just etched out by a nail, is that phrase, Glencalvy, the wicked generation, 1845. Now, this is not ancient history. And, as you walk on, you then see Alloway, which was a plaything of, of nobility who hardly bothered to visit. It's now Paul Lister who wants to reintroduce wolves. But, we have just sunk into accepting all of this because what? We don't know, because it's not up front, because what can you do? Because, 3, 4, 5 Land Reform Acts haven't changed any of this, because you sort of assume the rest of the world's a bit the same. It's not, because it's all a bit distant now. Of course it is, because you've lost all connection with the land. I mean, that pretty much had me stopped in my tracks, I've got to say, because that's a tragedy that's still working its way through our populations.
And contributes to, as you would say, that Scots being the most indoor nation at our latitude. I think you're off in a book thing next week?
No, it's November the 2nd, actually, so there's a wee breathing space. But the other thing, I think I've been asked to go and speak at as an All Under One Banner Wales event in Rill, and then to talk to Yes Cymru's branch in Carnarvon afterwards in just a couple of weeks, actually. So I'm trying to find a way to squeeze that in, because particularly because of these predictions of such an upset in the Welsh elections, I feel like we need to know more about what's going on at the moment in Wales. How does Yes Cymru work with Plaid Cymru? Because obviously the Yes movement and the SNP here are not exactly in lockstep, shall we just say. So there's plenty to ask, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to go, actually. So I'll have something to report back on. Maybe take the wee tape recorder and, record something while I'm down there.
Excellent stuff. I mean, I was certainly speaking to some of the friends in Plaid last month, and they're very optimistic and looking forward to the 2026 campaign. And there does seem to be a significant possibility that they'll end up as the largest party and possibly as government.
Mm-hmm.
So we will. On that note, I will put up the links to your book event on 2nd November. The podcast special for anybody that's not listened to on Culture was the 19th of August. If you scroll back, you'll be able to pick that one up. And I'll also put a link to the Estonia film, which talks about some of the digital revolution that the Estonians had, because it's a really excellent watch and well worth it as a refresher, or if you've not yet seen it. And on that note, we will see you at the regular time, hopefully, next week, folks.